Hello, I'm Dr. Sam, this is Dr. Sam's Health, and we're taking a break from COVID-19 coverage and moving back to talking about nutrition and diets. In my previous videos in this diet review series, I spoke about the diets in general, and we started the series with specific review of the standard American or Western diet, the diet that became possible pretty much after the agricultural revolution and that is currently associated with multiple illnesses such as hypertension, diabetes, and many others, the diseases that we tend to call the diseases of civilization. And at that point, it became absolutely obvious to me that since we are associating the diseases of civilization with the standard American diet, with the way we eat right now, and this way of eating became possible as a result of the agricultural revolution, it would totally make sense to look into the pre-agricultural nutrition and pre-agricultural lifestyle in general. Essentially, we are going to talk about the paleo diet, but quite frankly, I believe it's a very complex and very interesting subject, and I decided to make 2 or 3 videos on that. First of all, I want to talk about the ancestral nutrition, about the Paleolithic period and what our ancestors ate during this period. Then I will talk about the paleo diet, which tries to recreate this way of eating. And finally, I'll make the third video. Pretty much I'll make a scoping review of all the literature on the paleo diet and its effects on our health, longevity, and weight loss, if it's one of your goals. So today we're going to talk about the Paleolithic nutrition in general. And as always, I have a couple of disclaimers to make. First of all, this video will be heavily based on a couple of articles by Eden and Connor. They made a fantastic contribution to the field. They published a great article in 1985, which was called simply Paleolithic Nutrition, and they have outlined pretty much all existing research on human nutrition as we developed as a species. And that was an amazing piece of research, and you can definitely check it out on my website, drsamshealth.com. We've got a section there called Science, and if you click on that, you will see a small collection of articles that I believe are very interesting and informative, and I highly recommend you reading them. I'll also make small digests of these articles so that you can at least have a good idea of what is or are these articles about. So returning to Eden and Connor, I just wanted to give them credit for making such an amazing contribution to the field, and as far as I understand, this article became a foundation for the paleo movement in general. So I think it's a very important article, and if you have time and access to this article, please check it out. It's very, very interesting. And since I'm encouraging you to read this article, I have to make the second disclaimer, which is I'm not advertising or promoting anything other than good sources of information and healthy lifestyle. And speaking of health promotion, I have to remind everyone that though I'm a practicing physician, none of my videos are meant to be medical advice. If you need medical advice, please go to a family doctor or the emergency room if you are in an emergency. But these videos are merely educational and they represent only the opinions of mine. And here I have to stress that I do belong to several regulatory bodies and a couple of universities, and the opinions that I express in my videos are solely mine. They might differ from the opinions of the regulatory bodies and universities I belong to. So now we're done with disclaimers. I hope you will enjoy my video. It will be relatively long. I'll put some timestamps into the description to help you navigate, but I hope you won't need them because the subject is very interesting, and I hope that you will learn something and you will enjoy this video big time. So let's dive in. Let's start with defining some key terms. What does the word paleo mean in general? So paleo refers to the Paleolithic period, which is essentially the Stone Age. And I'm not an anthropologist, just a medical doctor, so I had to look it up, and I was surprised to learn that this period began 2.5 million years ago and ended just very recently in around 10,000 BC or 12,000 years ago. As you can see, this time period was pretty long, especially in comparison to our modern history, which is like a small dot on this timeline. And as you can imagine, a lot of things have changed, including our ancestors. So I think it is very important to talk about them in general, who our ancestors were. The beginning of this period coincided with the extinction of the Australopithecus genus and the first appearances of Homo genus. In my understanding, the very first notable species in this genus was Homo habilis, or skilled man, These were our remote ancestors who started using different tools, and they were quite effective in doing so. Later on, they transformed into Homo erectus, or straight walking man. We had different posture at that time, and later on they transformed into Homo sapiens, and to be more precise, there is a subspecies which is called Homo sapiens sapiens, which is effectively us. There is a very nice and well illustrated article on Encyclopaedia Britannica, and I highly recommend that you check it out if you're interested in human evolution. You can see lots of different species there with some nice illustrations, timelines, and so on. I'll add the link to this article to the description for this video. My major takeaway from this anthropological discourse is that this time period was very, very long. And as you can see, there were quite a few different species during this period. And these species were quite different from us genetically and anatomically. So what I would like to do, I would like to focus on the last 30-50,000 years of the Paleolithic period, because our ancestors who lived there is a general consensus on that, they were genetically and anatomically identical to us. So effectively we have the late Paleolithic period, and during this period we have a population of hominids who were identical to us, but they lived in very different environment. They were hunters-gatherers, they were not an agricultural society or societies, they did not farm, they had absolutely different lifestyle, and accordingly they had different health profile and different body composition and lots of other things that we can learn from and translate them into our lifestyle and our nutrition. And speaking of lifestyle, let's talk about theirs. So as you know, they were hunters-gatherers. They initially lived in caves, then they transitioned into some sort of small huts, and they moved a lot because they were hunting and gathering and harvesting stuff. There are some indications that they were able to fish, and obviously they were aware of fire and they could use fire to cook their food. They also were quite skilled with different kinds of tools, like stone tools and bone tools, and the remnants of these tools provide us with some information about their lifestyle in general. And of course they did some art. They were able to make some sculptures, some carved figurines. They started drawing on the walls of their caves, and that was another source of information about their lifestyle and indirectly about their nutrition that we can use for our purposes, for our research. And now let's try to gather all the information that we have about their lifestyle and try to understand what our ancestors ate. And I said that I would like to focus on the very late Paleolithic period, but I think it makes sense to mention a couple of things in the earlier Paleolithic or even pre-Paleolithic nutrition, because I noticed that when I was reviewing it, there were some sort of waves and transitions from almost completely plant-based food to almost completely animal-based food. So there were some waves. Our very, very remote ancestors, very early mammals, they were insectivores, meaning that they were eating insects and pretty much non-vertebrate animals. So their nutrition was based mostly on animal-based products, and we are talking about like 5 million years ago, even more. Then, as they were evolving and being successful in survival, they started to grow bigger. And as their size increased, their nutritional demands increased too. So these insects and small non-vertebrate animals, they were not sufficient and they were not a reliable source of nutrition, so they switched to vegetables and fruit. Actually, you might know that apes are mostly herbivores. So for example, if we take a gorilla, which is a huge ape, it eats almost exclusively plant-based food. But interestingly enough, when our remote ancestors diverged from apes, and that was happening even before the Paleolithic period, they started to eat progressively more and more meat. There is even a theory that consumption of meat and fat was necessary, like a prerequisite for development of larger brain and changes in our guts. So they became smaller, the brain became bigger, but brain requires a lot of energy, and there was some sort of a trade-off between the type of nutrition and the type of central nervous system that we could have. Anyhow, the bottom line is that our ancestors relied heavily on game in the early Paleolithic period, and later on in the end of Paleolithic period, they switched for multiple reasons to consuming more plant-based foods. Actually, lots of researchers claim that at least 50% of their nutrition was coming from plant-based sources. Here I would like to pause and make two notes. First of all, there is a great deal of uncertainty about our ancestral nutrition just because we cannot be 100% sure about what exactly they ate. We are relying on some direct or in many cases indirect evidence, and it's hard to tell what their nutritional composition was exactly. And the second thing I would like to say that there was a great deal of nutritional diversity due to multiple factors: the developmental level and lifestyle of particular community, the geographical location, the climate, things like that. There were quite a few different factors playing in and determining the nutritional pattern of a particular community. Cro-Magnons, for example, were one of our most developed ancestors, and they were big game hunters, and accordingly their nutrition was mostly animal-based. They relied heavily on game. And since we're talking about Cro-Magnons and different ancestral societies, we actually still have certain hunter-gatherer societies that survived until our days without being heavily affected by modern Western civilization. So let's talk about these modern hunter-gatherer societies now, as they are the closest we can get to our Paleolithic ancestors. Based on the available information on them, we can say that they are generally omnivores. They are getting between 50 and 80% of their nutrition from plant-based sources, with some exceptions. These exceptions are, for example, Aboriginal communities in northern latitudes, some tribes in Paraguay that are getting up to 80, sometimes up to 90% of their nutrition from animal sources. There is one big question here, which is how close are these societies to the ancestral societies in terms of their nutrition and lifestyle, but Eden and Connor state that they are as close as they can get. They are the best approximation to the ancestral societies, and we should use them as the model. Quite frankly, again, I'm not an anthropologist, I don't have any argument for or against that, and I will just trust the experts in this. One really great point that they make is that since these modern hunter-gatherer societies are harvesting wild plants and hunting wild game, free-range animals, essentially the composition of their nutrient sources is pretty much identical to whatever they could get 50,000 years ago. So they are very close to our ancestors in this respect. Which brings us to a very important observation, specifically that wild food sources are very different from farmed ones. And I think it's very important to talk about that right now. The meat or the flesh of farm-raised animals is very different from their wild counterparts, specifically in the fat content. The farm-raised animals, if we take their steak or a chunk of meat, the fat percentage there will be close to 25 to 30%, and we kind of like this marbling and high fat content. But if we take some, say, bison meat, we'll figure out that the fat percentage there is around 4%, which is several times lower than the fat percentage in the farm-raised animals. There is also a significant difference in the fat composition. Specific fatty acids are very, very different. For example, one of the very important omega-3 fatty acids that is supposed to have some cardioprotective effects, EPA, is almost completely absent in farm-raised meat, whereas the amount of this omega-3 fatty acid in wild meat, wild herbivores meat, is close to 4%, which is a huge difference. Now let's switch to plants for a second. There is also a huge difference between the plants that our ancestors could consume, or ourselves if we are left in the wild, and the farm-raised plants. And there are several notable differences. First of all, the variety of foods that we could get our hand on. Surprisingly, our ancestors had much larger variety of different fruit and vegetables that they would be consuming throughout the day during their harvest. They effectively were able to locate and find lots of different plants, whereas we are limited to whatever is kind of a mainstream thing in the supermarket right now. Obviously, there was a great impact of seasonality in terms of our ancestral nutrition, and we have less of an impact of season these days because we can get cherries and watermelons and Tron in the middle of winter that will be brought from another part of the world, and our ancestors didn't have access to that. But in my opinion, the most important difference is the composition of actual fruit and vegetable. The fruits and vegetables that we're consuming these days are highly selected, sometimes genetically modified, and enhanced in many ways. And accordingly, what we get is full of sugars and starch. There are lots of carbohydrates there, and there is a very bad ratio between starch and protein, starch and fiber. And for the amount of energy we get from sugars and starch, we're getting much less protein, much less fiber. So it cannot have a positive health impact, and likely it affects us in a very detrimental way. And finally, since we're talking about the differences between the things our ancestors ate and what we are consuming these days, I must make one important observation. There are things that our ancestors would never be able to eat, or they consumed in very minimal quantities. These days, in our guidelines, we got like 4 major food groups. Meat and fish, which our ancestors enjoyed greatly, and I assume that they have had these products of much better quality than whatever we get these days. The second category is fruit and vegetable. We just spoke about them, and what they had was less appealing in terms of their taste and texture, but at the same time it seemed to be much healthier than whatever we get these days. And finally, we've got 2 other groups that they pretty much never had access to. First of all, it's milk and dairy products in general. We are consuming quite decent quantities of them on a daily basis, whereas our ancestors would never get access to them unless they were consuming their mother's milk, but that's it. And of course, there is this 4th major food group, which I find to be absolutely ridiculous. It's bread and cereals, which for some unknown ridiculous reason became a staple food in our society. I do not know why our guidelines are stipulating that we are supposed to consume certain quantities of cereals and bread, why the breakfast became the most important meal of the day, and why we're supposed to eat cereals for breakfast. I can see how it's related to the agricultural revolution. I can see how it's related to the availability and the cost effectiveness of these foods, but at the same time I can see how consumption of bread and cereals leads to consumption of leptin, and accordingly all the issues associated with that, and overconsumption of carbohydrates, which I believe we consume too much of, and that on its own leads to huge health issues in the long run. And since we have effectively approached the idea of the nutritional composition of the diet, we can finally talk about the estimated diet of a Paleolithic human. As promised, I will rely heavily on the research of Eaton and Connor. They are expert in this area, and they have created this estimated Paleolithic diet. So what they have done, they have created this diet based on the 3000 kilocalories per day energy intake, which I find it to be a little bit too high for modern standards, but you know, they are the experts. They have their own reasons for doing so. It doesn't really matter what kind of daily caloric intake we're working with. The second part of this diet is that they assume that the Paleolithic human would get 65% of their nutrition from plant-based sources and 35% of their nutrition from animal-based sources. I can see where this is coming from, like from their research on ancestral or modern hunter-gatherer societies, and I completely agree with that. So they have calculated the approximate nutrient intake based on the all the data they could gather from all over the world and throughout the history. Based on these assumptions, they have estimated that an average late Paleolithic ancestor of ours would consume approximately 250 grams of protein per day, slightly over 70 grams of fat per day, and around 333 grams of carbohydrates per day, which in my opinion are simply great macros. First of all, our ancestors would get almost 2000 kilocalories per day from fat and carbohydrate, so that would be enough to support almost all activities of daily living that they needed to support with this energy. 3/4 of this energy, or maybe slightly less, 2/3, would come from carbs, which are fast and easy to use source of energy, and the rest would be supplemented by fat. They would also get a lot of protein, which would be enough to support all bodily functions, body recomposition, building of muscle, supporting immune system, things like that. And at the same time, since we got an excess of protein, in case they needed more energy for their metabolic processes, they could use the remainder of this unused protein for energy, which is, in my opinion, just, again, a very great distribution of macros. One of the major nutritional concerns these days is consumption of cholesterol, and we have very strict guidelines recommending consumption of not more than 300 milligrams of cholesterol per day. Unfortunately, our ancestors consumed up to 600 milligrams of cholesterol per day, which effectively is a double of the recommended daily amount these days. I don't think it was a huge issue given the overall great nutritional composition of their diet. Plus, personally, I think that the cholesterol issue is greatly overrated and taken out of the context, and in general, we should not vilify cholesterol to begin with. If it helps, we can convert this 600 milligrams of cholesterol per day into consumption of 2 eggs per day, and I don't think that having 2 eggs per day should be considered a major health issue, and I don't think it will ever lead to any kind of major health issues in the long run. I will definitely talk about this in the future, but now let's get back to the ancestral nutritional patterns and their diet composition, which was simply great otherwise. They consumed enough fiber, up to 50 grams per day, for great intestinal health. They consumed good amounts of vitamins, specifically vitamin C, some other vitamins that we are deficient in. They consumed enough calcium. They had a good ratio of potassium to sodium in their diet. Actually, they consumed much less sodium than we do these days. So in general, their diet was very well balanced, and it contained a lot of micronutrients that we tend to be deficient in, whereas our ancestors looks like they weren't. So that was obviously great. I don't want to talk about each and every number here. You can look the numbers up in either the original article, or you can check out my blog on my website, drsamshealth.com. The blog will contain a table with all the important nutritional information so that you can use it as a reference. And finally, I would like to talk about the association between the nutritional patterns and our development and our health. First of all, I noticed that the societies that were heavily reliant on animal-based products tended to be more physically developed, bigger in size, taller, stronger. I'm not sure whether it was related to nutrition or to their lifestyle, but I can give you a couple of examples. First of all, the Cro-Magnons that I already mentioned, they were on average 6 inches taller than their predecessors and then their descendants who switched to plant-based nutrition. I'm not sure how it translates into intelligence or cognitive functioning, but that's a simple anthropological fact. Another example is Paleo Indians, who were meat eaters, and their descendants who switched to plant-based foods tended to be 6 inches shorter, and there were some indicators of poor bone health and malnutrition in them after the switch occurred. Here, as always in this kind of cases, I would like to emphasize that I'm not encouraging everybody to go on, say, carnivore diet, and I'm not against plant-based foods. These are just my observations, and as you might know, I'm a firm believer that we are omnivores. I even made a video about us being herbivores or carnivores or omnivores. And my main conclusion is that we are omnivores because consumption of a variety of foods likely promotes better health, and that's the main subject of today's video too. As Eden and Corner made a clear connection between agricultural revolution, changes in our nutrition and lifestyle, and the complete epidemic of multiple health issues such as hypertension, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, cancers, and so on. They are claiming that this kind of diseases are pretty much unheard of in the modern hunter-gatherer societies. They are claiming that there was no evidence of this kind of disease in the ancestral societies. These are big claims, to be honest, along with the claims that switching to paleo diet would prevent us from developing this kind of conditions. I believe that all these things, they have a lot of merit in them, and I would like to give Eden and Connor credit one more time for making such an amazing contribution to the field. And I believe that today we have covered a lot of the historical observations and research, but the next video, the next two videos will be dedicated to the paleo diet, how it works, what we can eat, what we should not eat, and what are the expectations and how feasible it is in my personal opinion. And finally, when we're done with that, we can switch gears and look at the modern day research on paleo diet and its effects on health. I promise you it will be very interesting, and to be honest, I haven't done my research part yet, but I'm very curious what will the literature search yield in this case, what will be the outcomes, how helpful, how effective this diet is for weight loss, for prevention of multiple ailments, and so on. So if you're as curious as I am, and if you don't want to miss a thing, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, check out my website drsamshealth.com. We've got a number of resources there for you, for your information. We've got the blog, we've got the science part. Also, if you like my videos, hit the like button, engage in conversations with me on YouTube or on my website. Leave comments, ask questions, and I guess that's it for today. I'll see you in my next video. All the best.